So joining me now from Canterbury, New Zealand, is former Finance Minister Ruth Richardson. Ruth, welcome to Watercooler.
Good morning. Watercooler, is it? Oh, lots of good things happen around a watercooler.
Yes, that's what we think. Look, you had the big contest last weekend, of course. You have a minor contest this weekend, an election in New Zealand. I think it would be fair to say Jacinda Ardern is favourite at this stage. Are you prepared to call the result?
Well, I've been in the past tense calling Jacksit. I felt that the conditions were there for a spill. But it's fair to say that as the campaign has worn on and we had a reset, that New Zealand has succumbed to that old song, which is hooked on a feeling. And the feeling is that Jacinda has the star power, that she's been the mother of COVID care, and that the voters are focusing on the now, not the next, so that in their COVID fright, they are engaging in a flight for safety, which is the incumbent. And the National Party, which is traditionally the party of the contested ideas, has been unable to throw the circuit breaker. They haven't been able to move the conversation from fighting COVID now and the precautionary principle to what's next, which is how does New Zealand find its wings and fly again as an island nation on a pandemic planet. The National Party hasn't been able to make that case. And in fact, the other star of this election is David Seymour, who has consistently and coherently, in a very compelling and courageous way, put up the alternative narrative, which is we need dynamic in all of this, Kiwis, and the dynamic can only come from the forces of freedom and the market. And unless we unleash those, we're condemned to shivering in a corner and fright, all dressed up and nowhere to go. So my prediction is that the Labour Party will lamentably remain the government, and New Zealand won't have the propulsion that it needs in order to get off this COVID flattened canvas that we're all on.
Well, let's talk about that momentum in a minute, and the way you see bringing your experience to bear on the path out for New Zealand and the future for New Zealand. But first of all, just to bring our people up to date on this side of the Tasman, you went in very hard, of course, or Jacinda Ardern's administration went in very hard with a lockdown, and suffered quite a hard economic consequence there. The slowdown in GDP in New Zealand much higher than the slowdown here. How badly has she rocked the economy by doing this hard early lockdown with an attempt to separate the essential from the non-essential economy?
Right. Well, New Zealand went hard. We didn't go as early as we might, and we had a good deal of luck that by the time the government woke up to the threat and slammed on the anchors in terms of movement, there hadn't been a substantial hold in the community. So our island nation protected us. But it's fair to say that the thinking that's dominated our fear of science, which is the precautionary principle, and our attitude to breakthroughs in genetic and CRISPR technology that would improve our ability to, provide what the world wants from our soil and the sea, that precautionary principle has prevailed in our COVID response. So there have been sort of two parts to the government's action. One is just blindly follow the precautionary principle and to hell with the consequences. And when the consequences were immediately evident, harder and faster than most other nations, then the big bazookas of monetary and fiscal policy were applied. So those remain, in sort of 2D, the only responses we've got. Slam on the anchors and see what fiscal and monetary policy can do, when in fact we need the third dimension, which is the dynamic in the private sector. So there's been this dominant narrative, which is that in order to advance the economy, you have to eliminate COVID. And I simply don't believe that's a proper reading of the science nor of the economics. So Jacinda Ardern is all heart but no head.
We're in a very different kind of recession than we were the last one we had here, and I guess in New Zealand too, in the early 90s. Because then, of course, there was the lever of interest rates. You know, the banks could lower, the central bank could reduce interest rates, make borrowing easier, put money into the economy that way. You can't do that now, right? And what's happened in New Zealand is, I think they've gone over to really to printing money.
Well, we're not alone in that. And as I say, you know, if you apply the three tests that when we last met at the Mont Pelerin meeting in the Canary Islands, I talked about assessing or evaluating governments through three lenses: trust, relevance, and performance. So trust is very important. You know, you can lose it quickly, as the stuffed up Premier of New South Wales knows, or you can gain it, as, you know, Scott Morrison and indeed Jacinda Ardern, as the incumbent Prime Ministers, know that if you handle COVID with care, you can win trust. But trust of itself is not enough. Relevance is very key, and there's no doubt that governments are going to be centre stage in a pandemic. That's one of the core responsibilities of a government. How they discharge that responsibility is another matter. But it's really performance that we have to focus on. And it's the overall performance, of the government in managing COVID. In New Zealand's case, our public institutions were so unprepared and so inept that they're relying on the army to secure the borders and to ensure that we've got the cordon sanitaire, if you like, that's under army lock and key. You can't run a free country on that basis permanently. So the performance of the major institutions, our health institution, has been found wanting. Our pandemic preparedness has been found wanting. And now, of course, when you look at the performance that matters, which is in the economy, the public policy settings are being found wanting. It's not enough just to apply the initial, you know, big bazooka as the immediate medicine. It's what happens next. And the problem is we've got this in the time of COVID, which is so new, even my spell check won't recognize it. In the time of COVID, which is meaning for me massive disruption, you've got a clash between the precautionary principle on the one hand, reaching for what you know and erring on the side of caution, versus creative destruction. We're seeing a lot destroyed in the post-COVID climate. But where's the creativity? Where is the embrace of new public policy settings and new private sector endeavour that's going to let us emerge again, or as they say, build back better? To me, that should now be the focus, not the immediate COVID response, but what happens next and what does better look like.
Well, let's go on to what better looks like. And specifically, I think in New Zealand, as here, this has been essentially a small business recession. You know, cafes, small businesses gone out of business or struggled. How do we get the energy and dynamism back into that sector of the economy, which is really the grassroots, the lifeblood, if you like, if you don't mind me mixing metaphors, of how both our economies work?
Well, small business is the dominant business in New Zealand, but of course they only thrive off the general level of economic activity. And New Zealand has gone into this pandemic with a very poor productivity record, and with two or three big players and particularly one big market that have dominated. And the two or three big players that lift the whole economy are our agricultural sector and tourism. Now, tourism is effectively nixed for the time being, unless you want to put up with army-controlled quarantine for 2 weeks as your license even to cross the border. So our huge part of the economy has effectively been put on a very substantial pause, if ever it comes back. Add to that our foreign student injection into our education regime. They, alongside agriculture, so what we get from the soil and what we get from the sea, that has effectively represented the driving force of our economy. And of course, China, which is the only country growing in the COVID era, remains our most substantial market. And thank goodness we have that market for our agricultural produce in particular. So small businesses, they take their cue from what the big players do in the economy, and it's attention to the dynamic in the big players and productivity that now represent our major challenge. And of course, I would have to say this, fiscal responsibility, which has to be addressed down the track, which is our, not just our rainy day fund, but how we can ensure that the public sector plays its part. Fiscal responsibility, it would seem, is for sissies, that it's not fashionable to talk about the path back to fiscal responsibility these days. And I would wager that if we had our public institutions in better order, our public finances more focused on generating value out of public assets, and our private sector feeling the policy love, if you like, that enables them to recover that dynamic, that's our only surefire recipe for building back better.
Yes, indeed. You mentioned China, of course. Is there a sense, is there any discussion about the extent to which the New Zealand economy is exposed to China, that perhaps there's a need to look at diversifying your exports?
Well, that's a conversation that's not new around the boardroom and around the government table, but they are by far and away the most important trading partner for us. We are a trading nation. We obviously swim in one lane, which is a country dedicated to rules-based systems, to freedoms, to respect for political and social and personal autonomy. China swims in another lane, which is a communist, dictated, statist regime. We have to learn how we can sensibly swim in a third lane together that benefits us both. And it would be sheer folly for New Zealand to thumb its nose at the China trade when it does represent a willing market for our terrific products, I think of infant formula in particular, but a whole range of food-based products that have got great provenance and great, premium appeal for the growing middle class in China. But diversification, of course, matters. So for us, the ASEAN nations in particular represent a high level of appeal. Niches in Europe, niches in Africa and Latin America. But the big player is China, and it's going to remain so for a substantial period of time.
Of course, with Brexit, we've both got an opportunity now to start off on a new footing with Britain and move ahead pretty quickly, I think, with some trade deals. How important do you see the changing dynamic in Britain?
Well, it's interesting. Britain has had to fly in two formidable New Zealand and Australian figures to help them think properly about what trade can unleash. So Tony Abbott on the one hand, and Crawford Faulkner, who was our lead trade negotiator, he's been pinched out of Lincoln University here, and they both sit at the head of that, trade arrow, if you like, that Britain is yet to fire. Brexit has allowed them at least to, put that arrow in, it gives them that arrow in the quiver, but they seem so consumed by COVID and so exhausted by the debate to get over the Brexit line that they don't seem to have a clue about, what is the dynamic that trade can unleash. So it's instructive that our Prime Minister here, who 3 years ago was campaigning against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is now saying her first act on re-election, as soon as she can travel, will be to head up new trade initiatives to the United States and to ASEAN. So, the penny drops. For countries like New Zealand and Australia, we need to grab every free trade instinct we can and help them run with it. And in the case of Britain, we've got to give them a lot of support and a lot of intelligence as to what a free trade agreement looks like, because, for so long, that's been utterly suppressed when they've fell in with the Europe sclerotic system as their lot. So they've got to learn those trade tricks. But no doubt there's a huge payoff for unleashing a new free trade dynamic.
Economic freedom, of course, that's something that we've talked about in the past. That the ideas that came out of Friedrich Hayek, that almost always a free market will run things better than a government. But we've gone through this period this year, haven't we, where there's been huge intervention by government, government almost micromanaging the economy in some instances. How are we going to break that habit? How are we going to get back to where we were and go further?
Well, that is one of the, I think, very difficult legacies of COVID, because the government has had to be centre stage. Managing a pandemic is core to a government's responsibilities. So they've been at the height of their command and control powers. In the interest of public health, freedom has been compromised. And of course, economies are crippled because the normal dynamic of markets has been closed, has been shut down. So the more difficult thing is to say, right, that is the box in which a government properly belongs to manage the pandemic. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to carry that approach, and it's not recommended at all to carry that approach over into reviving a command and control economy. We all know how that ended. It ended in tears. So that is the fear I have for New Zealand, that the government, having seen the electoral payoff for command and control in managing a pandemic, will think that gives them license to command and control in the economy revival that follows. It doesn't. It's horses for courses, and the horse for the economy course is to as substantially and enthusiastically embrace unleashing of market forces as governments have unleashed fiscal and monetary policy in their first response to the COVID crisis. So I think for people of a like mind to you and I, Nick, and those who believe in the institutions of freedom in every domain, we've got a harder road to hoe, because governments perforce have had to be centre stage, have had to be seen as in high command, and how to wean them from that habit and unleash private sector forces is now one of the big struggles that the centre-right will have. And to ensure that the public understands that you've got to have two balls in the air. One is managing the COVID ball, but the other is managing the recovery ball. And recovery is only going to come from private sector decisions and institutions, people who are willing to invest and employ, and importantly, to innovate. And if the will to innovate is crushed by the power of the state, then economies are the loser.
Ruth, thanks very much for that contribution. We look forward to the opening up of the Trans-Tasman bubble, and welcome you over here to share some of your wisdom with us in person.
Okay, thanks, Nick, and may the best coach win in the next Bledisloe test. I suspect that the battle of the coaches is as critical as the battle of the team.